Hi friends, good morning. Welcome you all in this our subject Elements of Machine Design, whose subject code is 22564. And friends, as you know, we are in the next unit called as Selection of Anti-Friction Bearings and Gears. And friends, in the chapter, in previous lecture we have discussed what is my bearing, what is the main purpose of bearing, application of bearing, different properties of a bearing, correct? Then types of bearing we have discussed in detail. What is by difference between roller bearing and sliding contact bearing, that also we have discussed in detail. So friends, bearing or main function of bearing is that to rotate the shaft or to support the shaft. That is the main function of the bearing. And in front of us roller bearing is there. So friends, in today's lecture we are going to discuss derivation on bearing life of bearing, how we can calculate life of bearing. So simply we can say that life of bearing means number of revolutions or number of hours that bearing runs with constant speed without any maintenance, without any failure. What is my bearing life? Life of bearing means from starting of bearing, how much hours or revolutions of that bearing completed without failure. So see a definition of life of bearing. The life of an individual bearing is defined as total number of revolutions or number of hours at a given constant speed which the bearing can complete before the first evidence of fatigue failure develops on the balls or the race. Clear friends? What is life of bearing? Life of bearing means from start of that bearing, how much hours or revolutions of that bearing completed without failure. Without failure. After that, rating life. It is not by L10. So, if we say bearing life or life of a bearing, it is never calculated on the basis of the single or individual bearing. When we have to calculate the life of bearing, at that time we have to take a group of bearing. Many bearings we have to take in a group and we have to take readings, and then we can calculate the life. And such life called as a rating life L10. The rating life of a group of apparently identical bearing is defined as number of revolutions or the number of hours at a given constant speed that 90% of a group of bearing will complete or exceed before the first evidence of fatigue failure develops. It's known as rating life. Rating life means life of bearings or average life of bearings, those are in a group before first failure. Means in life of bearing we have to take one bearing and up to failure we have to calculate the revolutions or hours. But in rating life what we have to do? We have to take many bearings and we have to calculate the life of bearing on the basis of those performance of all those bearings. Clear, na? So friends, after that, see here, this is our very much important relation called as life load relationship. Life load means, as you know, if we apply more load, life goes on decreases. So what is the actual relationship between them? So extensive laboratory testing and subsequent statistical analysis have shown that relationship between the dynamic load C and equivalent load P and the rated bearing life L10 can be expressed by this equation. Means rating bearing life we can calculate by L10. So L10 is equal to C upon P bracket raised to A. C, what is C? Dynamic load. What is P? Equivalent load. And what is A? A, it is a constant. So A is equal to 3 for ball bearing and A is equal to 10 by 3 for roller bearing. And if we put C means dynamic load and P means equivalent load, we can easily calculate L10. Correct, na? So see here, if the rating life of bearing is given in hours at some constant speed, then rating life of an bearing in million revolution is given by L10 is equal to LH10 into small n into 60 upon 10 raised to 6, where n is equal to bearing speed in RPM, LH10 is equal to rating life of a bearing in hours at some constant speed, and L10 rating life of bearing in million revolutions. Means with the help of both formulae we can calculate the rating life. Correct, na? Means if bearing speed is given, rating life of bearing in hours is given, then we can apply the second formula. That is L10 is equal to LH10 into N into 60 upon 10 raised to 6, where L10 means rating life of bearing in million revolutions. That we can calculate by putting N means bearing speed in RPM and LH10 means rating life of bearing in hours at some constant speed. Clear? Now friends, there are two important terms are there. Correct, na? That is basic static load rating and basic dynamic load rating. Basic static capacity and basic dynamic capacity. So see here, first you have to discuss basic static load rating means C0. It is also called as basic static capacity. The static load is load acting on a bearing when the bearing is stationary. When the bearing is subjected to static load, it produces permanent deformation in a ball, the race which increases with increasing load. So clear friends, static load acting on a bearing when bearing it is in a static condition. Correct? And static load is applied when bearing it is in static condition. And static load produces permanent deformation on ball and race. And as your load increases, deformation goes on increases. So definition of basic static load rating C0. The basic static load rating C0 is defined as static radial load which corresponds to a permanent deformation of ball race at the most heavily stress contact equal to 0.0001 times the ball diameter. Means basic static load rating C0 is defined as static load is acted on the bearing radially on a ball and race, and due to that permanent deformation will be takes place. Clear? So formula is there to calculate basic static load rating. Basic static load rating C0 means at when bearing it is in static condition, load is applied on the bearing. Clear? What is basic static load rating? Basic static load rating means load applied on the bearing when bearing it is in static condition. So it is denoted by C0. So how you can calculate this C0? So C0 is equal to small f0 small n into z d square cos alpha. Keep in mind this formula to calculate basic static load rating means C0. C0 is equal to f0 n z d square cos alpha, where n is equal to number of rows of balls in any one bearing. What is n? Number of rows of balls in any one bearing. Z, number of balls per row. D, diameter of ball in mm, because all ball having the same diameter. D, diameter of ball in mm. Alpha, nominal angle of contact. What is F0? A factor depend upon the type of bearing. So 3.33 for self-aligning ball bearing and F0 is equal to 12.3 for radial contact and angular contact groove ball bearing. So as your type of bearing change, F0 goes on change. So in a single row angular contact ball bearing, the basic static rating relates to the radial correspondence of the load, causes radial deflection of ball and the rest in the way. So clear friends? Basic static load rating means when your bearing it is in static condition, load is applied on the bearing means ball and race, and due to that permanent deformation will be takes place of the ball, and it is calculated by C0 by using this formula. If we put all this value, we get C0 means basic static load rating. So friends, what is my static equivalent load? Static equivalent load. So it is noted by PS. P static it is called as. P for load, S for static. Static equivalent load denoted by P static means PS. So formula is there, with the help of that we can calculate the P static or static equivalent load. So what is my static equivalent load? Static equivalent load is defined as radial load which would causes the sum total permanent deformation of ball race at the under actual load condition. Static equivalent load means it is a load at that load at static condition permanent deformation of ball and race will be takes place. So static equivalent load is noted by PS means P static, P for load, S for static. So PS is equal to XS into FR plus YS into FA, where PS static equivalent load, P static called as, FR radial load, FA axial load, YS thrust load factor, XS radial load factor. And see here friends, XS and YS means radial load factor and thrust load factor depends on the type of bearing. Those are selected from the bearing manufacturing catalog. So friend, clear how you can calculate static equivalent load means P static, PS by using this relation. If we put these values, we get P static. After that friends, basic dynamic load rating means C. Basic dynamic load rating. So in previous term we have discussed static load rating. So dynamic load rating means When bearing it is in dynamic condition, it is in rolling condition, how much load is acted. See here, when the bearing starts rotating, the load is more uniformly distributed among the balls and race, thereby sustaining more permanent deformation than in static condition. The dynamic capacity of bearing is based on the fatigue life of bearing. So, what is basic dynamic load rating? Basic dynamic load rating means when bearing it is in motion, when bearing it is started, how much amount of load is acted on the bearing. So, in dynamic condition bearing is rotating, that's why chances of permanent deformation will be more than the static condition. So, see a definition of basic dynamic load rating. The basic dynamic load rating is defined as the constant stationary radial load, which is a group of apparently identical bearing with stationary outer race, can withstand for a rating life L10 of 1 million means 10 raised to 6 revolution of inner race. So basic dynamic load rating means when bearing it is in motion, how much load is acted on the bearing or how much load is acted on the outer race. And basic dynamic load rating is denoted by capital C. Correct, na? Now see here, equivalent dynamic load. Equivalent dynamic load, it is denoted by P equivalent. PE, P for load, E for equivalent, PE, equivalent dynamic load. So equivalent dynamic load means it is defined as constant stationary radial load which is applied on the bearing with rotating inner ring and stationary outer ring would give the sum bearing life as do the applied combined loading. Equivalent dynamic load means how much load is applied when bearing it is in dynamic condition, when it is in motion. So it is denoted by P equivalent, PE, P for load, E for equivalent. So PE is equal to XV FR plus YFA bracket complete into KA. This is the formula to calculate equivalent dynamic load. So where PE, P means equivalent dynamic load, P for load, E for equivalent. PE means equivalent dynamic load in Newton. FR, as you know, radial load in Newton. FA, of course, A stands for axial. So axial load or thrust load in Newton. X, radial factor. Y, thrust factor. V, rotation factor. Ka, load factor or application factor. It is 1 for the inner race rotating, 1.2 for outer race rotating, and 1 for self aligning bearing. So the value of X means radial factor, Y means thrust factor, V means rotation factor are given in manufacturer handbook. So on the basis of bearing, type of bearing, we have to calculate X, Y, V means radial, thrust and rotation factor. So clear friends? Likewise, P means equivalent dynamic load we can calculate. If we know radial load, axial load, radial factor, thrust factor, rotation factor and application factor. So friends, likewise in today's lecture we have discussed what is my life of bearing, what is my rating life of bearing, what is the relation of bearing life, what is my basic static load, what is basic dynamic load rating, equivalent static load, equivalent dynamic load we have discussed, and also we have discussed different formulas to calculate these different terms. So friends, okay, thank you very much.